Welcome to the Scaling Japan podcast. On today's episode, we have Kenneth Jeng. He is an investor and global platform lead at Headline. And on today's topic, we will interview him on the Japan startup ecosystem, and we're going to dive deep into some of the challenges, the current situation, and some recommendations on how to improve the Japan startup ecosystem. And the reason I want to get Kenneth Jeng on is we've already gotten a few different perspectives on the Japan ecosystem, but Kenneth has lived both in Japan and Silicon Valley. He has experienced and lived in Silicon Valley, and so it'll be interesting to hear some of his comparisons and insights and advice for the Japan startup ecosystem.
Before we start, here's a quick introduction to myself, your host. I'm the CEO of Smart Start Japan. We support setting up a company and back office in Japan. We also provide affordable advisory on raising capital, IPO, and other finance topics. I also run Scaling Your Company that provides courses and sales advisory and digital marketing agency services for the Japan market. If you need help, feel free to reach out.
Really great to have you on, Kenneth.
Yeah, no, super happy to be here, Tyson. I've been listening to the podcasts for quite some time now, so definitely a big fan and happy to dive into this conversation.
And when I was having conversations with friends, like Kenneth knows so much about the startup ecosystem. Like, damn, how does this guy know so much? But so I've been very impressed with your knowledge. Sorry if I'm kind of setting the bar kind of high, but no, I really like your deep analysis of the ecosystem. So it's
Yeah, no, that's definitely high praise. Hopefully I can live up to a fraction of that. I mean, personally speaking, I attribute a lot of that to just being a little bit too chronically on the internet, and a compulsive reader. So hopefully we can kind of bring a little bit of that to the fore, and I can kind of be the bearer of like third-hand wisdom or second-hand wisdom here.
yeah. No, when you were went for the startup co-creation, a Slack group, I was like, yeah, no, you posted a lot of content. I was like, and as soon as like I'll discover something like, oh, this is kind of cool, like, oh, Kenneth has already shared it.
Well,
So it's
I'm not sure if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but I mean, people tell me that they enjoy the content, so
yeah,
hopefully
it's
that's the case here as well.
cool. So I'm ready to dive in. First, I'd like to kind of focus maybe like what is the current narrative, and then maybe follow up with trends in the Japan ecosystem.
Yeah, for sure. I think one good point to start with, which you already touched on here, is that I think the Japanese startup ecosystem is, I think, oftentimes talked about a little bit in a vacuum, right? As I think with some of the other guests that you've had with, for instance, Startup Blinken and whatnot, I think a lot of the framing that I would want to start with is around this being comparative, right? So like, just in terms of a little bit of background here. So Tyson mentioned that I spent time in both the Silicon Valley and San Francisco, as well as here in Japan. But I've actually spent some time kind of looking and studying this question of how to build the ecosystem with a decent amount of time in Singapore, kind of Taiwan, as well as looking quite a bit at Europe, which I think is in many ways like a better comparison point for Japan. So, I mean, just to start from there, oftentimes I think we look a lot at Silicon Valley as kind of the gold standard, but a lot of the constraints and also opportunities in Japan, I think bear a closer resemblance to your New Yorks and your Londons and Parises, right? So think of 20th century economic juggernauts with a lot of history, legacy, and a lot of culture, but also like, on one hand that provides a lot of resourcing, and on the other hand, that makes it in some ways like a little bit harder to navigate, right? And there are a lot more
Mm,
stakeholders to address compared to like, kind of the Wild West gold rush culture, which I think in many ways is still very much present in San Francisco today.
cool. And also, could you elaborate a little bit more on maybe how Europe can maybe be kind of like maybe a more fitting example? Maybe, or is that like more like Europe in general, you think?
Yeah, I think that that's a really good point, which is like first and foremost, like Europe definitely isn't a monolith, right? But my observation here is that when you look at the attitudes of investors, kind of regulators, corporates and whatnot, and kind of I think traditional attitudes towards entrepreneurship, a lot of those things in Europe are much closer to what you see in Japan, just kind of on a slightly different time scale, right? So like, even though we see kind of a pretty bustling and in by some measures like quite successful startup ecosystem in places like Paris today, we go back like 10, 15 years, right? And a lot of the kinds of complaints and comments that you hear about the French startup ecosystem then are things that you hear here, right? A lot of the things that you hear about, say, like, traditional, say, like institutional German investors or angel investors and such, are complaints that I've heard in Japan as well.
Ah, gotcha. Could you share some of the complaints?
Yeah, so I mean, again, not to lean into stereotypes here, right? But like, as a random example here, when people have complained about, say, like raising from continental European investors, kind of one stereotype that people have is that you have to go through like 300 papers of paperwork. You gotta get somebody to stamp every single page, right? Oftentimes investors are going to ask for much more aggressive terms on their end, where they want like 30 or 50% ownership for, a 500K seed check, right? Things like that, right? And there's also kind of the idea that a lot of the investors and whatnot have much more of a conservative standpoint towards the growth of a startup. There's kind of this binary that is often placed, which is like, are you engaged in kind of power law investing, which is what
Mm,
venture is theoretically about
yes.
in San Francisco, or is it about value investing, right? So, I think a lot of the stereotypes that you see in Europe, and kind of the legacy instincts of a lot of the stakeholders in the ecosystem there bear a little bit more resemblance to the challenges and kind of framing of problems that we see here in Japan today.
Now that we've gotten that out of the way, I want to maybe shift the focus on maybe the current narratives and trends again. So what are some of the current narratives and trends you're seeing in the Japanese startup ecosystem?
Yeah, for sure. So I think with the framing set, the first thing I want to put out there is that personally speaking, I'm quite bullish on the Japanese startup ecosystem, especially in the medium term, right? And I think this is supported and borne out by a lot of the discourse that we're having about Japan right now. It does seem like it's kind of Japan's time, kind of under the sun to shine a little bit, right? And so first and foremost, right, is that I think you see in the news is that there's a lot of international capital that's starting to flow into the Japanese startup ecosystem. I think just the other day we saw kind of this huge fundraising round. I think $100 million Series A, ginormous, especially by local standards, for Sakana AI.
Sakana, I gotcha. Yeah.
And then yeah, I opened the kind of TV, so to speak, and I see the general partners of major international, mostly American venture capital firms kind of setting up shop in Japan or saying nice things about it, right? So there's the news last week that kind of Andreessen Horowitz, one of the leading VC firms in the world, certainly one of the largest, is setting up a Tokyo office. B Capital, which is another pretty well-known VC firm, was on CNBC saying like nice things about Japan, basically saying that they were looking for companies to back and to bring international and whatnot. Now, I've personally had like a number of conversations with very well-respected investors, especially over the last year and a half, that are either looking into investing in Japan or already have, right? So like leading investors, literally like Silicon Valley royalty. So like your Kozla Ventures, as well as other investors like NEA, have already kind of started opening up their checkbooks to look at opportunities here.
And I think even Sakana AI, they received investment from NVIDIA.
Correct. Yeah, that's a pretty big deal.
Yeah, no, it's very cool. And maybe any other, so I guess you're bullish on the medium term.
Yeah,
And
I am, right? So like kind of going to back in kind of the international angle here is like, this isn't happening in a vacuum, right? So there are a number of like pretty notable drivers that are making this happen right now, right? The first and foremost is Japan is naturally, as everybody knows, a very large economy, right, with a very large population in terms of like developed countries. People kind of underplay this, but in terms of like countries that have a per capita GDP above like 300 or 400K, no, sorry, 30 or 40K USD a year, and a population over 100 million, it's basically just two countries. It's just like the US and Japan, right? And Japan also has like what the second or third largest stock market in the world by market capitalization. And so like it's a very liquid stock market here, which is actually in international terms like quite rare. And so first and foremost, like there's a lot of things like US China trade tensions and friction and kind of the capital flight, so to speak, from China that's now looking for a home. Some of that is coming
mm,
to Japan naturally. If you have an APAC allocation as a capital allocator, and you're looking for places to park your capital productively, then very naturally, I think people are going to start looking at Japan a little bit harder. You also see this, kind of across asset classes, right? So like VC really is spec compared to like some other asset classes like public equities. Private equity, for instance, right, as a broader asset class has funds rate, firms raising like $10 billion funds to invest in Japan PE. Of course, I think a lot of people are familiar with the real estate boom that we've seen in recent
yeah.
years, a lot of international investors. So it's really kind of across the board. And it's like VC really fits into a part of that. Another point that I would kind of come to here is that beyond US and China, there's also kind of this emerging kind of Southeast Asia, Japan angle, emerging Korea, Japan angle, emerging Taiwan, Japan angle as well. So, there is a story in Southeast Asia, right, which is that, despite the fact that, Japan's relatively close, right, geographically, and for a lot of people, it's still like a pretty unfamiliar market that's very
Mm,
open. That being said, there have been a couple of companies that have been able to actually quietly like IPO in Japan, right? So like even unicorns and whatnot. So like one example that I would bring up is there was a Taiwanese unicorn called Appier, which is kind of an a
uh,
from a couple of years ago. They didn't go and IPO on, NASDAQ or anything. They actually IPO'd here. And so like Japan, there is like this emerging angle in which like Japan conceivably could become kind of a neighborhood alternative to going public on Nasdaq. And this is in particular important for Southeast
mm,
startups
yeah.
because the problem that's been the case over the last 2 years or so is that pretty big lack of liquidity, right? There have been relatively few exits, and once you get past like the big 6 or 7 exits in Southeast Asia that have been able to go get big enough and go on Nasdaq, past that there really isn't that much, right? And so
Yeah,
like
like just to get the revenue to get into NASDAQ.
it's
In
crazy,
addition, yeah.
and so like there's been a reassessment of kind of like what's realistic, at least in the short term in a lot of these markets, which is like you come in with a Silicon Valley playbook or expectations and valuations. Do these markets actually adequately support them, right? Whereas like if you come and you try IPO on Mothers, like I mean this is another topic that we'll cover like, the average mother's IPO is
Yeah.
like less than $100 million in market cap, right? Which on one hand is like probably not great for the ecosystem as whole and the growing ambitious large companies. But on the other hand, like it is actually like kind of an escape valve for a lot of companies that like desperately need to return money to investors, but don't look like they're going to make it onto Nasdaq.
Because no, I would agree with, and I would say in some cases, like companies, even like with 20 million, they still been able to raise on Mothers, get that IPO in. And no, but it helps bring liquidity back into the system quickly.
It
as
does.
opposed to
Yeah,
disappearing completely in some cases.
exactly. Right. So that's kind of like on the macro kind of finance side. I think on the for the economy and society as a whole, right? So like I see a couple of interesting macro trends that I think could bode well for kind of tech slash startups as a whole. As everybody is familiar, one of the biggest ones is demographic changes and a shrinking population, et cetera. So one really interesting thing about that is I think that next year is the year that things actually really start changing and biting in such a way that incentives shift. So, despite the fact that Japan's population has been shrinking since 2010, not very many people know this, but the labor force has actually been growing with the entry of more women and the elderly into the workforce. However, beginning in 2025, the labor force is going to start shrinking. And despite the fact that Japan's also become like a big immigration country, kind of
Mm.
globally, right, with net 330K immigrants a year, we're going to see a point where uh, incentives are going to start shifting for people to start investing in productivity raising solutions, right, and technology and such, or else they just won't be able to sustain their business.
And and what we're seeing on the ground level too is like immigration, like they've been delayed, like they're delaying like three or what. So at least in permanent residence, you could usually get in 6 months before. Now it's taking 1 year. And like business manager used to take 3 months. Now it's taking 5 to 6 months. Like, immigration can actually keep up with the demand right now. And despite that,
Before we dive in, I wanted to thank today's sponsor, AIM B2B, and recommend them for anyone entering or expanding in Asia's intricate B2B market. AIM B2B is Tokyo's leading integrated marketing and PR agency. Since 2008, they've helped global brands thrive across Japan and APAC through intelligent strategies, data-driven implementation, and cultural expertise. Their proven adapt, implement, maximize framework builds trust through localized storytelling and drives measurable growth through strategic performance marketing. They're HubSpot certified, seasoned in account based marketing, paid media, GEO, SEO, and more. Ready to expand? That's AIM B2B. Always forward. Give a shout out to Robert and the team for supporting this podcast. Now back to the show.
Yeah, no, exactly. And like to be sure, like, immigrants aren't like a monolith, right? I think there's a lot of question about like, what kinds of people are coming in, are the kinds of people that would start businesses, start startups and whatnot. But like, one thing that I found is like when I talk to a lot of people here, I find like that there's a pessimism bias and a lot of people here, right? Like some of the comments I've gotten from people is like, oh, I don't know why people, are coming
ah,
and right. It's just like, why would you come here? So on and so forth. But the reality is that like people are coming here, right? So a lot of these people who are applying for permanent residency are in fact like highly skilled professionals, right? Like people on the HSP visa who are like
yeah.
who want to spend some time in Japan or settle down here. So like, regardless of whatever people think. Like the reality is like a lot of smart, talented people, etc., are choosing to come to Japan, like work here. And
Yeah,
I think we're starting to see that in the ranks of some entrepreneurs as well.
yeah, no, definitely. And I think one thing they just mentioned is the quality of life in terms of safety, what you can buy, entertainment, but just the quality of life in Japan is very high.
Yes, that's one narrative, right? I think certainly there are people for here for a quality of life. On the flip side, I've heard people kind of interpret that as a negative, right? Which is like, if people are here for quality of life, why would you do anything as hard as starting a startup here, right? So surely these are the wrong people. Surely these are people who are just here to chill and not to do anything serious. And to be fair, like, that there, first and foremost, there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. But I also think that that's probably the wrong narrative. And there's actually, in pockets here or there that I've encountered, people who are you know, relentlessly ambitious and very hungry and who have somehow landed in Japan in one way, shape, or fashion. One thing I would be curious about, right, is for us to like actually do some sort of comprehensive survey to like try to figure out exactly why people in this target demographic are in this country. I have
Mm.
my theories, right? One is kind of the weeb hypothesis, right, which is like people who grew up with a Japanese pop culture in the 80s and 90s and whatnot are now reaching like kind of peak earning and professional prowess. And so like,
Yeah.
are chasing their weeb dreams to like spend some time in Japan. On a side note, like I actually know for a fact that's kind of one driver, like both the quality of life thing and also the weeb thing, like kind of the cultural soft power thing, is like one of the reasons why like so many Silicon Valley people are like, if not moving
Yes.
here, like coming through
Yeah.
Japan in recent years, right? I have like good knowledge that people who are quite prominent in Silicon Valley have spent like multiple times like a year in Tokyo. Maybe just because they like it, but maybe because there's also potentially opportunity here.
And so I think the prettiest make would be maybe a foreigner would be sent here by their company. Their Japanese wife would want to come back. And so you get this highly skilled, let's say Silicon Valley worker or technical person come back to Japan. But it's still anecdotal evidence. But now I'm seeing more of just, even like foreign couples who are both highly skilled workers, just who want to come to live in Japan for several years.
Yeah, it's an interesting phenomenon, right? Like many things, it's multifactorial. I think we attribute a lot to like the kind of familiarity that people have with Japan to a greater degree these days. Kind of the emergence of like technological solutions that make living in Japan much easier, even without a high degree of Japanese proficiency, right? So even like your Google Maps and Google Translate, and also like in some ways like the internationalization of Japanese society has been in full swing really for the last decade plus. I've been coming to Japan like in earnest for almost 15 years now. And like it is like tangibly different, right? And like, I think in many ways the government has done a good job to uh manage this situation. Like at least, as far as I can tell, a lot better than in a lot of other countries.
And I guess back on the trend of why you're bullish on the medium term, are there any other reasons you're bullish?
Yeah, I think, touching on what I just mentioned about the government, right? It's just like, it's clear that over the last couple of years, there's been a legitimization of kind of startups and venture in Japan, right? So, you have the kind of stereotype, yeah, I even heard it, like earlier that like, like only kind of people who become entrepreneurs or like kind of start businesses or startups are kind of weirdos who can't get a job elsewhere, right? That's starting to change in some ways where there's clearly a big institutional effort to push startups as like a kind of career path. You have the president of Todai, the Tokyo University, the most prestigious university in Japan. Yeah, I think in the commencement speech, or like I don't know, I forget. It's like the Nugakishiki, what like
I
the
guess you like, let's
oh, the
say,
opening ceremony, right?
yeah,
It sounds like
opening or
language like that.
welcoming. Well,
Like one of those, right? Where he's like, hey, like, consider like doing something great, right? So consider, like starting a startup or something, right? So like clearly there's been like a cultural shift here, along with like a lot of government support that goes towards this. Now, on one hand, one thing that I think you might hear from kind of naysayers and whatnot, and to be fair, I have my own kind of measured view on this, is that, for people to do really great startups, ideally they're people who want to be pirates rather than people who want to join the Navy, right?
yes,
Like very little.
I'll let you elaborate.
Yeah, exactly. You do get more people who want to join the Navy, but I would posit that in a society like Japan, like you kind of need that more, right? Because otherwise it's just much more difficult to do business otherwise, right? So I think the legitimizing effect of this, like, you hear about startups that participate in XYZ government programs or XYZ corporate accelerators. In some ways, like not because they get something like material from that participation, but because they get the stamp of approval, which, I think makes it easier for their business partners to do business with them or like procure things from them and such.
Or I mean, let's say there is efficiency where let's say people follow the same rules or follow the same format
Yeah, for sure, right?
and economies of scale in a way.
Yeah. So like I would put it in the terms that like insofar as like culturally in other countries and in a number of other countries where like becoming an entrepreneur and doing startups and whatnot is already like say like at this degree of legitimate social legitimization whatnot, like Japan and the powers that be are just trying to raise it to that level, right? And so you get the people like relative to the general population are like 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 in terms of risk taking, whereas like
Yeah,
previously you had to be absolutely a 10.
yeah, exactly. And I think one of the big changes as well is in Japan, like what's it, a non-personal guarantee loan. That was non-existent for is I think only due to this shift in paradigm towards being more startup friendly that the government is providing let's say non-personal, meaning if of course they're not just going to give it to anyone, but if your company were to fail, you're not going to be held personally liable. And I
Yeah,
think that's a monumental.
it's huge. And you see it in the way that government budgets are being allocated. I won't share any like specific numbers here, but they're actually quite monumental, right? So like, people are putting their money where their mouth is, right? And insofar as I've had interactions with people in some of these government agencies and whatnot, I found them to be quite earnest in their desire to like kind of do something. And insofar as like things fall short, I think that's in many ways a part of the learning process, right? Like nobody comes out fully formed. And I don't think we should expect Japan's startup ecosystem to kind of come out fully formed and like at this kind of grand scale and sophistication, right? So like
Yes.
if I were to sum all of this up, right, like I think there's a what my like the message that I would like to share today is that like um there's something clearly shifting and going on here. And if there is any pessimism, I think from Japan's like kind of last 20 years, 30 years of economic stagnation, is that I think there is a case to be made that the past is not indicative of the future, right? And it's probably still kind of slightly non-consensus about Japan, but like I think that we're in the early innings of something, and insofar as we believe that incentives determine outcomes, the incentives for basically everybody in this system are starting to shift from individual workers to entrepreneurs to institutions and the government.
And I think this is a perfect segue, but what are some of the challenges you're seeing and maybe what can be done about them?
Yeah, for sure. And salient topic, right? Because I think the discourse on Japan, just personal view again, is that it swings wildly from kind of naively optimistic to like depressingly pessimistic, right? In a weird way, there's a duality to this where like it's not that either side is right or wrong. I actually think like both sides are right, right? It's just that they're right at the same time. So, with that said, like kind of diving into kind of challenges and pessimism here. So, first and foremost, is like has really set Japan apart as an ecosystem, in my view, is still, and I hate to lean on kind of stereotypes or preconceptions about Japan, but like it's the insularity of the ecosystem. And it's insular in a way that I haven't really seen anywhere else. So like, I've tried to spend a lot
Even
of time.
compared to like Taiwan.
Oh, yeah, even compared to Korea, compared to Vietnam, compared to like let alone your Singapores or Hong Kongs, right? Regionally. Where, there are people I've met in places that have, objectively much smaller venture ecosystems like Thailand and whatnot that have a little bit more international connectivity, right? So I want to be like balanced about this, right? Because like first and foremost, like international connectivity is not necessarily a means like an ends in itself. It's a means to something, right? Which is to say that like there's a kind of this other sort of, which is like Japan is like it's kind of like a Goldilocks size, except like the Goldilocks size is like the wrong size. It's like the bed's just
Uh,
it's a medium size, right? So it's too big to want to go abroad and like too small to like actually scale, right?
yeah,
But one of the things that's been a big push and narrative in
and
recent days,
or,
especially just like in the last 2, 3 years, is this kind of like Japan to global, like go global initiative. You hear this like go global thing like literally every other day. As somebody who like almost like violently supports this initiative, even kind of tired of hearing about go global. But the reality is that it's like hugely necessary. But the problems are that like in so many ways it doesn't seem like we have the critical mass of people who have the requisite experience in a way that's kind of like not talked about enough is the enough people who have the requisite soft skills and ability to engage people, I think, authentically, organically, and build those to person connections that are like so critical. Um, and there's a saying about venture, right? Which is like venture is the vibiest asset class, right?
Viviest.
It is the most vibe, like it's based on vibes,
Gotcha.
right?
Okay,
Which is like
gotcha. Yeah,
other things, you can look at a spreadsheet, you can look at
yeah,
financial.
or EBITDA or something. Yeah,
Yeah, right. So
or
like we're one of the well, we work in one of the parts of the economy that like are the most dependent on like personal chemistry, right? To like get deals done. Um, and if I were to be like slightly inflammatory with one hot take here, it is that like the kinds of people that you would generally see leading large swaths of the venture ecosystem in other Asian countries, and to a lesser degree like Europe and whatnot, are not the people who are in charge of it here. Like that's not necessarily a good thing or a bad thing. Again, I think it's kind of a consequence of like decades of history and culture and the construction of economy and like LB relationships and whatnot. But one thing that I have observed, right, is like, you look at a Southeast Asia, just go to look at the GPs of all the funds, right? Now start counting the number of them that went to school undergrad, like abroad, right? In the US predominantly, and the UK, and to a lesser degree, like Australia and whatnot, right? It's like very, very high percentage,
gotcha.
right? It's the same thing that you see in Taiwan, and even to some degree, like in Korea, right? So you look at some of the Korea's like biggest startup successes, like some of its first unicorns and whatnot. There were people who went to Harvard, right? Or like went to US schools and whatnot, right? And like a lot of Southeast Asian startups are like, oh
Mm.
yeah, like it's three founders who met at like Berkeley and then just like
Yeah, I think that was like
yeah,
the grab story or something.
yeah, and like did this thing in Indonesia and the Grab story and all this other stuff. You're very familiar with this. But that's not exactly how things work here. And so like insofar as it comes to like, being in the social flow of things and like everything that's associated with that, the flow of capital, the flow of talent, expertise, and information, Japan kind of has to find its own path, right? One more thing is like, a lot of those people who fit that criteria and fit that profile. Again, it's not a cure-all, right? They're here. There are plenty of those people in Japan. They just don't work in venture, right? They don't work in startups at all.
Or a lot of my friends are in either Shosha, doing sales, or I think finance as well.
Yeah, a lot in finance, right? A lot for your international finance companies. And if I were to delve deeper into some of the challenges that I see here, in a lot of ways, I think what we enjoy a lot of Japan, and especially Tokyo is like a lot of the subcultures, right? Like Japan's a fantastically interesting place with a lot of very deep subcultures. However, that also means that there are a lot of these groups of people that are hugely siloed from each other, right? Which is that, what I've seen here is that like the kinds of people who work for international tech companies and startups entering the Japanese market almost never work for domestic startups. right? They don't even like startups to startups, like you don't even really see that happening, right? You a lot of loan kind of your big tech to startup pipeline, talent pipeline. A couple months ago, or maybe like I think a year ago, the president of Grab was actually in Japan, I think at an event hosted by Coral Capital, and I asked him a question about kind of what he saw as kind of the origins and development of the Southeast Asia or the Singaporean startup ecosystem. Um, One thing that he cited was like, you had all these MNCs come into Singapore, bringing a lot of people around. And after 2 or 3 years, some people got bored and were just like, let's try to do something. And then they started startups, right? Uh,
Gotcha. And MNC means multinational corporation. But
yes.
please continue.
Yeah. And these feel like talent pipelines that I don't see as being quite as robust. And again, I think there are a lot of reasons for this, and Japan startup ecosystem has its own fair share of successes, right? And a lot of reasons, you go back and forth about the merits and like who the ecosystem should try to recruit and who should be elevated and whatnot. But the reality is that this does, I think, put us at a very real disadvantage in terms of going global. And I'm not averse to the idea that like Japan can like figure out how to tack it kind of itself, right? In some way in certain industries and whatnot. But personally, I that's kind of not what I would tend to believe.
I want to ask you in that terms of going global. So I think a big part of going global, I guess there's one is companies that are venture backed and ones that have IPO'd. But do you find that maybe those who have tried to gone global, maybe they get punished on the markets or it impacts their relationship with venture capital?
So, one narrative, right, that I've heard is that a lot of investors discourage startups, I think, behind closed doors from expanding internationally, right? There's a long story here, right? Which is that like the asset class of venture capital in Japan has like a specific set of return expectations, which don't necessarily necessitate
Gotcha.
like home runs, right?
Yeah.
Insofar as that is true, like what investors are doing in terms of discouraging international expansion is just rational in their view, right? Insofar as they just need to like kind of get, a 2x, 3x, 5x outcome. Wouldn't you want a more sure outcome with where you guide these startups to like a 100 million IPO on Mothers? Rather than trying to swing for the fences. And then it's something that you have no experience in, like nobody on the team has any experience in. You don't know where to find the talent. And then, even though you're saying all these things publicly, do you really believe in your heart of hearts uh, that like this is a good idea?
And I've heard that even if you get like a 5 to 10x return, that's usually pretty, like for Japan, they're like, cool. But
Yeah.
like maybe in Silicon Valley, they'll probably want probably 30x, sometimes 50x, and some
You're
places
like
even
100x or
100x.
whatever, right? I mean, like,
Yeah.
there's again, I don't have the data in front of me, right? But like what my understanding is, like I don't have the data for like historic fund returns for like all the funds in Japan, right? Like, but my understanding is that like a lot of funds here, especially strategic corporate funds, in some cases they don't even need to return any real money, right? They just have to hit their target returns are 1x. It's just like just don't lose money,
Yeah.
right? All we want is like, access to this stuff. Maybe it's just like a marketing
Ah, I gotcha. Yeah.
right
Marketing, yeah, PR
and
or just
uh
access to the technology.
yeah,
Just
and the
don't lose it.
people and kind of where the market is going, whatever they can sell to like internal stakeholders on this. But like, it seems like the powers that be, the other powers that be, the government, right, like are trying to shift this, right? They're trying to change this. Um, and there are some people, some funds, some investors, some entrepreneurs who are trying to do something slightly differently as well. which, if I were to do a small plug for what we're trying to do at Headline, I think moving forward, is to not necessarily like we're not looking to supplant what already exists here. I think what we would ideally want to foster is to create a space for people who do want to engage in more international, ambitious businesses. When it's appropriate, connect them to sources of international growth capital. I have a pretty strong view that startups are highly path dependent, right? You see this in, the screeds about company culture where like your first 15 hires determine your next 100 hires, etc. And so I think there's a case to be made that like whatever intervention or guidance or norm setting
That's
around
what you mean.
development stuff, it has to happen much earlier than most people are currently discussing right now, right? Like currently in the ecosystem, there's this idea that, oh, we'll just like grow them domestically to a certain size, and then you'll have Sequoia
Mm.
come in at a Series D, DST Global, whatever, these big international growth funds, and they'll take it from there. I don't think that's actually largely viable, right? It's like,
Yeah, no, I would agree with that.
yeah, like, but at that time, yeah, at that point, it's probably too
Right.
late.
The DNA has already been
Exactly.
intertwined.
Yes, exactly. And also with Japanese labor law making it like very expensive or very difficult to make personnel changes, you're screwed, right? Like, I guess we'll just do a local business or like, a domestic business. And one last piece of data that I think like backs this up is one thing that's slightly damning, right? Is that there was a recent article that came out in Nikkei Asia. It's called like the second valley of death for startups or something like that in Japan, right? Uh,
Yeah, yeah.
it highlighted that newly IPO'd companies in Japan
Yes.
actually grow slower than like companies that have been on the market for more than 15 years or something, which is ridiculous. It's like the only country in the world where that is the case. And there's another article in Forbes that kind of came out like I think last month
Did they
that
have any insight into the reason why?
I have my hot takes on this, right, which is that Uh, long story short, I think a lot of startups here, for the lack of a better term, I think start running out of steam and start running out of ideas after they saturate their first market and their first product category, right? Again, I don't want to paint with too broad of a brush. There is some very great operators here. There are, some very good product people here, etc. But just anecdotally, my sense has been that there are a lot of startups that once they hit what they think is PMF with one product in one area, there's kind of
Gotcha.
a lot of confusion around the strategy as to like how to build a coherent product suite, right? Around that. So there's this idea that if you think about SaaS, right, which is like you start with a point solution that's really sharp, that gets you some market share, builds a company, and then after that you go multi-product to solve
Yes.
multiple different related problems because you still have the same team. So, and there should be synergies and you have distribution for these customers that have, these problems and you get to know them. And you go multi-product and then you build a platform, right, for further stickiness that, other things can plug into on it. It's kind of a playbook that a lot of people have, executed on again.
And I mean, there's a playbook. And I think recently when I was listening to Sasser, I might be misquoting Jason Lemkin, but I think at 10 million ARR, he's saying like you should really
Start
start
looking.
thinking about it.
Yeah, and I don't think we broadly necessarily do that here.
Yeah,
Um,
no, thinking about
uh,
it. 'Cause I think even like Money Forward, like when did they start their enterprise software? It wasn't even close at the 10 million marker. It might have been more like the, let's say, 50 or 100 million marker.
Yeah, exactly. Which is really interesting. And in a lot of cases, I think, again, no shade to anybody. I think that, you know what you're doing, you know your business obviously far better than I do. But just from an outsider's perspective, a lot of the products seem to be largely unrelated. Slash, in certain cases, the startups are actually providing tech-enabled services rather than product type, like actual products, like as product companies, right? Which means that they face an uphill battle in terms of scaling revenue. And again, kind of coming back to like kind of the people angle and kind of the international angle is like if you can't if you struggle to do business internationally with your current team, it's like triple as hard to like provide international services, I think, in some ways, even more so than products. You know, you can't be like a Deloitte or a McKinsey or so on and so forth, even if you are providing like,
Oh yeah, no.
right? Because nobody else is going to
Yeah,
buy
no
your
one
stuff in Japanese, right? Like maybe
exactly.
yeah, like people buy anime, like content, right? You just slap subtitles on it.
And I was
You're not going to buy like, Japanese consulting services.
and I was thinking even if you had like, 50 million AR, or I'll say maybe I won't be able to, I can't say that I could, or I guess I did work for a corporation that had, I think around 30 to 50 million, but for my own company, which was near 10, if I had to think about it in hindsight, I think we actually could have created a second product. Like it actually would have been really good timing where the founding team is still very active. We know everybody, and like let's say we would have the flexibility to push it through and not have that like, oh, we didn't get results for like 6 months, let's scrap it. So I think that is kind of interesting, that
Yeah.
point where what I mean, what kind of what you're saying, where in Japan it's they make one product, it gets very big, but let's say by the time they start making the second product, I guess maybe after the IPO, they start to slow down just because they don't have the internal infrastructure to really execute on that.
Yes.
And like,
Yeah.
and just the other one, like they've released so many products by that point that, they have the playbook, they can execute the playbook, they have the team to launch it as well. Because I was thinking, like in our case, we did have like a new business development team. And like I think by the second, or I ended running the subsidiary, but I think, and we did study abroad, but I think for this, if we were to do a third business, we pretty much would have a whole playbook in play.
Yeah, yeah, totally, right. One more thought here is oftentimes I think once you get to that level of scale, it is still beneficial to have access to good talent, like leadership and functional talent that has been there and done that. I actually think that in many ways that is the secret sauce of Silicon Valley and kind of the US more generally, is that you have access to people who have been able to do that. So like leaders and like experts and whatnot, they're not going to get PMF for you, right? However, like the really good ones are actually incredibly helpful when it comes to actually building out an organization at that scale, right? And also, coming up with XYZ optimizations, both locally and I think at a higher level across the company. And unless you have access to that on some level, like you're gonna really struggle. And I think very few operators scale for the entire life cycle of a company, right?
Mm.
Of course, there's a debate around this that we don't want to get into about like founder mode versus manager mode, as is kind of going on the interwebs these days. But the reality is that when I've had conversations with these leaders, these functional leaders in Silicon Valley, they overwhelmingly provide a higher degree of sophistication and thoughtfulness, I think, honed by years of intense competition in the most competitive market in the world, right? And they're also standing on the shoulders of giants. So like they're like learning from, it's like seven generations of startups and like coming through. It's like, yeah, by the point that, they're having this conversation and like being director of engineering at this company.
Yeah, especially I mean, how many people can you really talk to about like we're basically gonna triple or double in size for the next 4 years, and someone who can just, who's experienced it, they can not, I want to say like outright a book, but they could outline it like this is probably what's gonna happen, this is what's gonna happen,
Yeah, totally. And
and just guiding you through that.
even if it's not about like copying the playbook, I think one objection I hear often in Japan is like, hey, a lot of these people, they don't understand Japan, right? They don't get this. You can't do those things here. And so in some cases it comes off as kind of like this allergy to having these quote unquote outsiders involved in these companies and whatnot. It's kind of like bipolar, right? Like you have that, and you also have like lionizing these people and putting them on a pedestal on a stage.
But there is a middle ground, like because let's say the impossible one, it's like yes, I might agree that it's impossible for this organization, but there are people out there who we could bring in to make it a reality.
Exactly, right. And some of these people are actually really good at solving problems with first principles, right? So like even if they don't know your particular situation, they are in fact experts at market entry into XYZ international markets. And broadly speaking, I think that's the kind of talent that we would love to see like across the entire board in the ecosystem, right? And have that in for us to
Yeah.
work side by side with, upskill with, um, not to see them as competition, but like an opportunity to raise the general competitiveness and therefore generate better outcomes for, everybody across the entire
And
ecosystem.
and I've had the pleasure to have multiple conversations with multiple people in, I think that they're part of the go-to market for like, a Series D or E company. They've done it in several markets. And when I listen to them, like, it's like, damn, you guys got it down to a playbook. Like, even though you don't get Japan, or like not get Japan, but I mean, even though you're just entering Japan, like, I think you guys will figure it out.
Yeah, like you talk to people, say like OG like Uber city launchers, and the kind of degree of both hustle and also inventiveness and creativity that they brought to their job, like adapted to specific local conditions, is actually pretty inspiring, right? And it's kind of stuff that I would love to see more and see up close.
That's one thing we're trying to, or that was kind of one reason I created the Japan Scaler series. Right now we're in the Scaling Japan podcast, but we've gotten some from TripAdvisor, YouTube, DD. We just did one on Uber Eats recruitment and just showing cases where, they have scaled in Japan.
And slight hot take here is like Japan is unique in many ways. I also do not think that Japan is a special snowflake, so to speak, right? Like there are, in fact, there are principles, right? And there are approaches that kind of cut across countries and contexts and markets and people that are, in fact, if not directly applicable, like as is, are adaptable for Japan, right? And like, if you wanted to talk about like just getting some incredibly smart, motivated people to work on a problem, like the reality is that there are dozens, if not hundreds, of international companies that have successfully scaled in Japan across tech and other industries. And it's also true that there are dozens, if not hundreds, of Japanese companies that have scaled internationally. It's just that very few of them or none of them are tech startups. A lot to say about like one challenge I have for people is like, hey, look at like Toyota's US website. It is
Or
like the
like,
most US ass website you've ever seen. I've seen very few Japanese tech startups that achieve that degree of localization for the US market.
one of my friends was saying like the trading company is like, they just created like sushi, kaiten sushi, like open up like 30 shops in different countries, super success. Like, so the trading companies have already built the playbook, and it's just, how can we get, let's say, they've already gone through that life cycle. And
Yeah.
like, so where they can train the next generation, they've done it. So I think it's just kind of bringing that to startups. Thank you so much for joining, Kenneth, and sharing your insights.
All right.
And I'll
Cool.
reach
Thank
out
you.
after.
Yep. Cheers. Bye.